Hello and welcome everyone. This is second lecture on Hobbes, and in the previous lecture we have discussed Hobbes' conception of human nature basically, and how to understand human nature and his behavior in a much more scientific manner with a kind of materialistic conception of human being and human nature. And this understanding of human nature is necessary for Hobbes to develop a much more sophisticated or scientific understanding of sovereign, which exercise absolute power over their subject. So, the theorization of politics in Hobbes is rooted in this understanding of human nature and a very materialistic understanding of human nature. So, he is not having any moral or ethical presupposition about the good or bad conduct of the human being, but he reduced human being to a kind of scientific objective definition, which is like any other material objects in the physical world. So, driven by the Euclidean theory of geometry, the major premises in Hobbesian political philosophy is based on this scientific understanding or definition of the parts which constitute the commonwealth or the sovereign. So, in the previous lecture we have discussed that how Hobbes defined human being as a matter in motion with a bundle of desire and aversion. So, the movement of human beings or his behavior, his voluntary act or endeavors can be understood scientifically when we look at this dominant passion or desire in the individual to gratify their ego, to constantly seek fulfillment of their desire, and all the voluntary acts or endeavors of human being as a matter in motion is towards the fulfillment of desire, and the fulfillment of desire is the source of happiness according to Hobbes, we have discussed in the previous lecture. Today we are going to focus on his idea of sovereign and why sovereigns should exercise absolute power, and to understand that we need to understand what he calls the state of nature. So, in the lecture today we will focus more on the idea of sovereign, how it is constituted through covenant or social contract, but before that we will understand this hypothetical construct in Hobbesian political theory, that is of a state of nature, and this becomes then the basis of any arguments or discussion on politics in contemporary times. So, the legitimacy of all the rule or all the government even today is based on the consent of the people, and we will see that how we can trace the roots of such thinking about the legitimacy in this social contract tradition of which Hobbes was the founder. So, we are going to discuss this state of nature, the covenant, and how sovereign should exercise absolute power, and in what condition human beings have right to revolt against the sovereign. So, this we are going to discuss in today's lecture. In the following lecture, that is the third or concluding lecture on Hobbes, we will focus particularly on his theory of political obligation, that is why we should obey the sovereign, and then we will conclude our discussion on Hobbes by critically assessing Hobbes' political philosophy in the light of newer interpretation. So, let us start with this idea of sovereign and a state of nature, and what drives Hobbes to develop this absolutist authority. So, the major or the central concern in Hobbes, like in many other previous thinkers we have discussed, is to devise a theory of politics that would help establish peace and order in society, and that establishment of peace and order would make civic life possible. So, for the individual to lead a happy life or a prosperous life, it is absolutely necessary that there is a peace and order in the society. So, in the absence of peace and order, there is no possibility of living one's life happily, or pursue something which one consider as just or good. So, Hobbes in that sense shared this concern with many other philosophers like in Plato or Aristotle or Machiavelli we have discussed, that the central premise or central concern in their political theory or philosophy is to establish a order, and that concern is there in Hobbes. However, there is a kind of distinct where the participation of everyone in the political life or in the public life is required, say in Aristotle and Plato, but for Hobbes human beings are perfectly okay or justified in living their private life or civic life, which is different from the public and the political life of the state or the sovereign. Nonetheless, the concern that Hobbes has is similar to the other political philosopher, that is how to establish peace and order in the society. And he regards that only a sovereign which has absolute power, so there is no division of power, there is no kind of mixed rule or mixed constitution or the mixed government, it has to be a one singular body, maybe of one body or a group of body or person, but that body has to have a kind of indivisible or absolute power over their subject in order to establish peace and order in the society. So, he regards a sovereign with the absolute power could establish such peace and order, and this sovereign is then not a given body or not justify its existence on some other premises than the people coming together and forming this sovereign through contract, through a covenant. So, in that sense the sovereign is an artificial construct. Artificial is through the covenant or through the contract among the people, and these people is a kind of radical conception of people where the life of everyone is of equal birth and they are all equal participant in forming or constituting this sovereign. So, there is a kind of movement or logical progression in Hobbesian thinking from a human nature to the state of nature and the formation of the sovereign. So, the sovereign body is not something which is a kind of given natural entity to which we must abide by or submit ourselves to, but it is something which we have created, and this artificial construct is the precondition for the civic life that will ensure peace and prosperity in the society. So, this agency or involvement of human beings in the construction of the sovereign is a radical departure from the previous thinking about the politics. So, the government, why should we obey the government? Because the government is something which we have constituted, which we have given consent to, and that consent is the basis of the legitimacy of the government even today. So, in that sense Hobbesian political philosophy in true sense is not just logical and scientific, but also a very objective or unambiguous explanation of political authority, which is the construct of the human being, not God representation or any kind of divine origin. So, this sovereign which is absolute and necessary for establishing peace and order in the society is artificial construct, and this is the greatest gift of human nature. So, even when we are envy, we compete with each other and there is a war of each against all, yet there is some unique traits in individual which enables them to construct something like the sovereign, which will establish peace and order and thereby preserve the life of individual and enable them the condition to flourish in trade, business, commerce, art, science and philosophy. So, in that sense this artificial construct of sovereign in Hobbesian thinking also gives us a sense where the human nature for human being is not all bad or evil as there is in Machiavelli's account. So, he regard human being capable of constructing something as good as sovereign, which will create the condition for peace and order for everyone to flourish in their personal life. So, this sovereign is the artificial construct which represents the multitude of free and equal subjects who come together to constitute it. And this terminology of free and equal subject and the voice of the multitude is represented in one voice of the sovereign. So, the existence of sovereign is first dependent on the people coming together and constituting it through a covenant, and B, it is representative of these multiple voices, the multitude of the voices, and that is very unique in Hobbesian political philosophy. Now, this sovereign which is thus constituted could be in the form of one man or an assembly of men or a group of men, or maybe when you have the individuals capable enough to regulate their insatiable desire and to live peacefully through mutual coexistence or in relative peace, then there is no need of any authority. So, some kind of anarchist thinking is also possible when the individual behavior can be regulated by themselves through their rational moral sense of modesty or temperance and so on. However, since human beings constantly try to fulfill their desire and their desire is at conflict with others person's desire, there is a need for someone who can arbitrate between these conflicts, and therefore, there is a need of the sovereign. So, the sovereign could be of one person or a group of person or the assembly of person, but as a sovereign body it must represent the will of the multitude. So, the existence, the legitimacy of the sovereign is to represent the will of the multitude. So, all the voices of the people are legitimately, authoritatively represented in the person of the sovereign, and therefore, we must obey the sovereign because it is our own construct and also it represents our will. So, why we should obey the sovereign, we are going to discuss in the next lecture, but he gives a very logical reasoning for why we should obey the sovereign. So, this the sovereign authority that Hobbes was envisaging is both absolute and indivisible. So, the power or the authority that sovereign exercise over the subject is indivisible. It cannot be shared by different groups. There may be the consular, there may be other institution, but the sovereign is not bound to follow their counsel, whereas everyone else is bound to obey the command of the sovereign. So, the laws and legitimacy of laws, and without any confusion which law is having the force, that means if one does not follow the law, there would be coercive apparatus which will force that individual to abide by the law. The justification that we have is in Hobbesian understanding that the sovereign as the representative of the people and their voice knows what is good for them, and in that spirit the command of the sovereign is the law. So, what is law? What sovereign says is law, and everyone should obey that law because sovereign, which is the representative of the people, says so. So, there is no confusion about what is law, what is the correct law. It is something which sovereign says or the commands of the sovereign. So, this authority of the sovereign is thus absolute or indivisible in a sense. It does not get divided into, like in present day, three organs of the state: legislature, executive and judiciary. In Hobbesian conception, this Leviathan or the sovereign exercise all the power in one body or in the group of body, and once that body is constituted, everyone should abide by the command of that body, which is sovereign. So, the primary responsibility of the sovereign is to create and maintain peace, and this you can connect with the prevailing condition in English society of civil war or the factionalism between the royalist and the parliamentarians on the one hand, and the temporal power or the monarchy on the one hand, and the religious authority on the other. So, this was a kind of turbulent time where Hobbes was arguing about how to restore or establish peace and to maintain it. So, the first or the primary responsibility of the sovereign is to create and maintain peace and thus protect the life and liberty of the individual subject. So, Hobbes was very wary or apprehensive about the political turmoils and instability which continuously pose a threat to life of the individual, and he argued that life in the absence of a common authority would be as miserable as in the state of nature where each is at war with everyone else. So, in the absence of a common authority which has absolute power or indivisible power, life would be miserable. The reason being that there will be constant war or constant threat to everyone's life, and everyone will all the time concerned about the preservation of their life, and if they devote all their energy or endeavor to protect their life, there is no scope of trade, business, industry, philosophy, art and science. In other words, the civic life would become impossible, and therefore, there is a need of the sovereign with the absolute power. So, Hobbes regarded sovereign authority as a precondition for social and economic prosperity for the individual and society. So, Hobbes and other social contract tradition theorists have provided a theory of state which is very different if you recall Machiavellian understanding of principality or the prince, or in Aristotle or Plato. In the social contract tradition, we have a theory of a state which paved the way for natural rights and a universal language of politics. So, what is the legitimacy of the state? What is the responsibility of the state? Why we should obey the state becomes the basic tenets of political discussions in modern world, and we can trace it in this social contract tradition. So, state has its legitimacy not because it is representative of the divine will on the earth, but people themselves create this artificial body, state or sovereign, and we will see how within social contract traditions there is a difference between Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, but nonetheless they all argue this is a artificial corporate legal entity to create the condition for individuals to lead their life, to lead a happy, prosperous, stable life without coercion, without any threat to their personal life and liberty. So, the state exists to protect the individual life, and if you recall, the fundamental responsibility of modern state is to maintain law and order. That means, there should not be arbitrary violence or coercive or violent arbitrary actions among the individuals. If there is such prevalent violence or violation of contracts, then you have the authority of the state to arbitrate, to enforce the law. So, the basic fundamental task of modern state is understood as something about maintaining law and order, and that maintenance of law and order enables the individual to pursue their interest, to pursue their desire, and thereby leads to prosperity in all walks of life. So, this kind of understanding about the state and the politics you have in the social contract tradition. So, they provide these natural rights that even the state cannot take away certain rights. So, which you call the fundamental rights for instance. So, the very existence of a state is to provide protection to individual rights, and there is a complex debate on what are those rights. There are moral rights, natural rights, legal rights or fundamental rights, but this very discourse of right which is inalienable, which a state must protect, is something that we can trace to this natural law tradition or natural rights tradition beginning with the social contract tradition. So, thus the idea that authority of the state does not rest on divine right, but the consent. So, all forms of authority has its legitimacy. Why certain institution or public institution and its command or instruction we must obey? Because it has the legitimacy, and its legitimacy rests not on some divine right, but on the consent that we have given. And once we have given the consent, then it represents our will. That means we authorize them to exercise certain power. And in such condition, if they ask us to behave or do in a certain act in a certain manner, we must obey it. So, that is the consent which is very crucial to understand the legitimacy or the existence of any state and authority in modern politics or in modern state, which you can trace to this social contract tradition. So, the state and its existence is not because of divine right or any given rights, but because the human beings as free and equal member coming together to construct this legal corporate entity. So, the governed had certain inalienable rights, and the existence of a state is to protect those rights. These maxims form a new basis of political discourse in the modern world, which we can trace to this social contract tradition. Okay, now let us move on to discuss Hobbes' idea of a state of nature. And this state of nature you should not assume as something real, actual or the given kind of status of human livings. It is just a kind of hypothetical, ahistorical and theoretical account. So, this idea of a state of nature Hobbes construct in support of his conception of absolute power of the sovereign or the absolute authority of the sovereign. So, this is a hypothetical, ahistorical, not historical. There is no given manifestation of such kind of life. It is a kind of theoretical construct in support of Hobbes' conception of the absolute power of the sovereign. So, Hobbes provide this hypothetical, ahistorical and theoretical account of a state of nature before presenting his account of the construct of commonwealth or civil authority with absolute or indivisible power. It is not an actual primitive stage of living. So, if you think of hunting and a gathering kind of society, that was the stage of human life. Hobbesian conception of a state of nature is different from that kind of historical understanding of human life. It is hypothetical construct, how human being will behave in a condition where there is no civil authority, there is no authority to arbitrate among the citizens or the individuals, and what kind of life would be there. Will there be happiness or stability, and if not, why we should create something which will provide us those conditions of life that will enable us to pursue our desire or to pursue our private life. So, it is not an actual primitive stage of living. Hobbes deploys this idea of the state of nature to describe the miserable condition of lives of human beings in the absence of a competent authority. So, this hypothetical theoretical construct is based on this idea of how human beings as a matter in motion having constant desire, and desire is not something seen as bad, it is necessary for living. But if it is not regulated, if it is not controlled, then it will lead to chaos, it will lead to anarchy and conflict and war of each against all. So, how this human being as a matter in motion will behave in the absence of a civil authority or a competent authority, that Hobbes calls as a state of nature. It is not the actual real historical stage of life or the primitive lives of the individual. It is merely a kind of hypothetical understanding of human beings as a matter in motion behaving in the condition of absence of any competent civil authority. So, he uses it, that is the state of nature and the idea of state of nature, as the basis for justification of the absolute power of the sovereign, which we will discuss after this discussion on the state of nature. So, Hobbesian state of nature is a perpetual state of war, which is a war as is of every man against everyone. So, this perpetual state of war is of everyone against everyone else, because there is a threat to everyone else's life, and all the endeavors or the voluntary actions of the individual is guided towards the preservation of life, and everyone is right in doing everything that helps him or her to protect her life. So, that is the natural right, that is the kind of understanding of natural right, that all human beings have equal worth, their life has the similar value, and they all are equally justified in doing everything that helps them protect their life. Now, everyone else, if they tries to do everything else, then there is a constant flux, there is a kind of constant uncertainty, and there is also a mutual sense of distrust or insecurity from each other. Now, there will be a kind of then perpetual war where everyone will be constantly trying to outperform or outwit the others in securing their life, and that will lead to a kind of power for the sake of power. You constantly try to acquire more power and more power without ever getting the sense of security because of the state of nature, because of the absence of the competent civil authority. But when you are provided the order and the security by the state or the sovereign, then you can behave in a decent manner, in a civil, justified, rational manner. But in the absence of that, there would be a kind of perpetual war of each against all. So, this description of a state of nature follows from his characterization of the human being as a bundle of desire and aversion, which you can recall from the previous lecture, and their dominant traits that are the source of this perpetual conflicts and war of each against all are basically these three things. One is the competition for power. The second is a mutual sense of insecurity or fear of life from violent and sudden death, and excessive pride or what he calls vain glory. So, why in the state of nature there is a kind of perpetual war? Because there will be competition among everyone to exercise or to accumulate as much power as she can, exercising his own ability, weight, rational or sense perception. Now, this competition leads to constant enviness among each other, and there will be no finality or ceasing of this constant search for more power, and that will lead to. So, suppose let us take it this way, if you have few individuals or one individuals constantly trying to accumulate power, that is okay, but if everyone else tries to acquire more power, it will naturally lead to conflict, it will naturally lead to enviness and war. Second, if there is a kind of mutual sense of insecurity of life, then individual will do anything treacherous or not treacherous, just or unjust, desirable and undesirable to protect his or her life. So, there is a kind of absence of trust that leads to a sense of mutual insecurity, where everyone see everyone else as a kind of enemy or as a kind of envy or a rival, and now they will do everything treacherous or untreacherous, lawful or unlawful, just or unjust, that help them preservation of life. And the second is the human beings, which is a self-seeking creature and constantly seek honor or glory, which he calls the vain glory. This leads to insatiable desire to accumulate power for the sake of power. That will lead to a sense of honor among the similarly competing groups of individuals. Now, in that condition, there will be always the attempt by others to outperform the others. So, there is three things of competition for power, mutual sense of insecurity and threat to life and death through violence or sudden attacks or conflicts or war, and finally a sense of vainglory, sense of insatiable desire for honor from the mutually competitive equal citizens and subjects, lead to a state of war or perpetual state of war of each against the all. So, thus the state of nature creates a condition which is miserable condition of life, which makes any kind of civic and peaceful life impossible. And in the absence of civil and peaceful life, there could be no industry, cultivations, arts and science, and worst of all, life itself would be that of constant fear and ever present threat of violent death, and the life of man would be the famous word of human beings in the state of nature: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. That is the characterization of life in the state of nature according to Hobbes, where there is a kind of constant fear of death from violent actions or sudden death. People will not invest in long term industries such as farming, business or cultivation of science or philosophy, because there is a uncertainty and the primary fear is of that of life. So, all the endeavors of human beings will be channelized towards preservation of life, and there would be less and less focus on the cultivation of science, arts, industries, farming and so on. So, the life would be a miserable life, which would not allow the individual to lead a civil life and private life in the absence of a common civil authority. However, in the state of nature, Hobbes recognizes certain natural law and certain rights of the individual, which is natural rights, which is inalienable rights, and sovereign and its existence is premised on this necessity or this requirement to protect those rights or to respect those natural laws. So, Hobbes does not present only the negative character of human beings, as we have seen in Machiavelli or the Christian theology, that man is a fallen being and the redemption depends on the God and submission to the will of God. Similarly, in the Machiavelli, the human nature is necessarily wicked, and if the human natures are wicked, how a prince could establish order. Here in Hobbes, you have a kind of understanding where human beings are capable of creating something as good as sovereign, the artificial construct. That gives us a sense that human beings also calculate the consequences of their action and in what ways one can preserve one's life in the long term, and that leads them to create this artificial construct which we call Leviathan or sovereign or the civic authority. So, Hobbes does not present only the negative characters of human beings as it is in Machiavelli's account, And in the state of nature, human beings do have sense or reason to deliberate upon the actions and the consequences of those actions. So, human beings are passion driven, driven by their desire and aversion to some things which displease them or which force them to behave in a particular manner. That means anything that brings displeasure to them, they will be averse to that kind of action. So, even then human beings as a bundle of desire and aversion will gradually develop this sense of their action, and they will calculate the consequences of their action, which kind of action will lead to preservation of their life and which kind of action will lead to its threat or destruction of their life, and they will preempt any actions that will be a threat to their life. And this understanding of human being as having sense or the reason to deliberate upon the actions and the consequences of that action is there in the state of nature as well. And for Hobbes, man could be good or bad depending upon their desire and passion and the circumstances of living. So, in the state of nature, in the absence of a common authority, even the good man or the honest man will behave unjustly to protect his or her life. So, it is not that human beings are innately good or bad. They could be good and bad depending upon the circumstances. So, if you have the circumstances of life where civil authority or the sovereign will provide the condition of peace and order, the human being will behave lawfully. But in the absence of such authority, human being will do everything that helps them to preserve their life. So, that is the kind of understanding that Hobbes has about men who could be good and bad depending upon their desire and passion and the circumstances of living. So, human beings according to Hobbes are rational, innocent and moderate too. They would behave peacefully or in a just manner under the command of civil authority. However, it is the absence of such authority in the state of nature and constant threat to their life from violent and sudden deaths that make them to do everything under their command or power to preserve their life. So, that is how he saw life in the state of nature and defines human beings, though rational and also having some sense of what is desirable and what helps them in the preservation of life, yet they will behave unjustly or any manner that is possible under their power or command to preserve their life, because there is no authority that will guarantee them peace or protection of their life. So, thus eventually the people develop an understanding of the need for laws and authority. So, because the life of human beings in the state of nature is miserable, there is a perpetual war of each against all, and yet they have some sense or rationality or rational calculation of their actions, and they then develop a kind of common understanding of the desire of law and authority which will provide them the peace or the stability and order. So, they develop an understanding of the need for laws and authority through rational deliberation, and these are based on certain natural laws. The first law of nature is based on the idea of seeking peace and order, and the rights that individual has follows from this. So, human beings should seek peace and order. However, in the absence of that peace and order, everyone has natural right to do everything to preserve his life or liberty, or preserve his or her life. So, that natural rights Hobbes gives even when the sovereign is constituted. So, he describes many other types of natural laws too, such as each life is of equal birth. So, in the state of nature there is no hierarchy between the monarch or the common layman or the aristocrat. All of them have the similar equal worth. Each one should treat others in the same manner as he wanted to be treated by them. One must obey the terms of contract and covenant, and man has the right to defend himself and cannot be forced to be a judge in his own case. So, the natural right justice that we have even in modern democracy, where even the accused of the worst crime has natural right to defend himself, and he cannot be forced to be witness or the judge of his own crime. So, it has to be proved beyond doubt through evidence to punish a person even when that person has committed the heinous crime. So, there is this kind of natural right to given to the individuals is something that we have in this social contract or tradition, and the discussion on natural laws and natural rights, and the whole idea of laws, justice and the state you have in the modern world can be traced back to this social contract tradition. So, these natural laws according to Hobbes are rational percept which must be followed. These exist in the state of nature. So, these kind of rights, that everyone's life is of equal worth, everyone should treat everyone the way he or she wanted to be treated by the others, the covenant or the contract should be followed. So, these are moral rational percepts which exist in the state of nature too. However, in the absence of a common authority, it could not be enforced, and that is the problem in the state of nature. When human being through their deliberation or through their rational calculation arrive at certain common laws and the rights of everyone, but it cannot be enforced because there is no authority, there is no sovereign, and that makes these laws and rights merely a kind of word without any force. Everyone can violate it as and when it is suitable to them, and that will lead to condition of war of each against all. So, hence the need for a sovereign with the power of the sword to enforce this law, and that leads to the creation of the sovereign. Now, covenant and the making of the sovereign or commonwealth, if you look at the basis of the constitution of a commonwealth or a sovereign is social contract or a covenant. So, the constitution of the sovereign or commonwealth is based on the social contract and covenant or each against all. So, in this covenant and contract there is a participation of everyone. So, this contract is a contract of each against everyone else. So, they come together and constitute this sovereign through a covenant, through a contract among themselves. It is constituted to avoid constant threat to life and establish peace and order, and Hobbes called such sovereign as Leviathan, which is a biblical expression meaning mortality god. It could be one man or an assembly of men. However, Hobbes in Leviathan preferred monarchy over other forms of sovereign. So, nonetheless he is equally okay with the sovereign where there is a group of men or the assembly of men or one man. But in all its form, sovereign authority is an artificial construct. So, it is not the given natural divine entity, it is the creation of all men coming together through a covenant, and such an artificial body then represents the will of all and is committed to the preservation of natural laws and rights, that is the preservation of life, peace and order in the society. So, the terms of covenant among the free and equal individuals, so those who come together, they are not divided in any kind of hierarchy, they are all having equal worth, and there is a kind of equality that is there among the people. So, they are equal and come together on their own voluntary free will. So, the terms that they have of this covenant through which they construct the sovereign is that I authorize and give up my right of governing myself, which is the natural right. So, in the state of nature, everybody has the right to govern himself or herself. However, when they come together to form this construct, they agree that I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or this assembly of men, that is one man or the assembly of men or group of men, on this condition that you give up your right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth in Latin civitas. So, that is the basis of the formation of the sovereign or Leviathan, when human beings come together and have a contract among each other, and this each other is free and equal member. There is no hierarchy that exists in the medieval Europe and in the classical Greek Roman times. So, thus sovereign is a body which is institutionalized or constituted by the multitude, and all its actions and the power is authorized by this multitude again. So, this sovereign is institutionalized by the people and authorized to act and exercise power on their behalf. So, the power that sovereign exercise is the power of the people. The people themselves through their contract authorize the sovereign to exercise that power, and therefore sovereign cannot make mistakes or cannot behave justly. And why it is so, we will discuss in theory of political obligation. So, this group of people also voluntary as a free and equal being, in contrast to hierarchical worldviews, commit to obey the commands of the sovereign. So, once they institutionalize the sovereign and authorize them to act on their behalf, commit themselves to follow the commands of the sovereign. So, Hobbes also argued about another kind of constitution of sovereign. So, one is that of through institutionalization, when people on their own free will who are equal come together to constitute this sovereign through a covenant, and the terms of covenant are when other person who is equal and free are also agreeing to transfer their rights to govern themselves to this body or the body of man, then the sovereign is institutionalized. The other way of institutionalizing the sovereign is through conquest or acquisitions of new territory. So, in that sense also the sovereign could be established, and the conquered people must obey the new sovereign to preserve their lives and liberty. So, similarly he argued about ecclesiastical sovereign as well, but he gave it a more secular content in terms of its power and responsibilities in protecting the lives and liberty of the people and establishing the condition of peace and prosperity in the kingdom. So, that is how he argued about the institutionalization or the constitution of sovereign through a covenant among the free and equal member, and also through acquisition of the property, new territories or conquering the new territories or new people, and also by the ecclesiastical sovereign on the basis of religion and scripture. Now, the sovereign thus constituted should have absolute and indivisible power. So, this is the attributes of the sovereign as Hobbes envisaged. So, according to Hobbes, the sovereign thus constituted has two attributes. One is representation and the second is authorization. So, representation in a sense that it represents the will of the multitudes of free and equal member and utters it in one unambiguous voice. So, the will of the people is legitimately, authoritatively expressed by the sovereign. So, the most legitimate and the authoritative voice of a people is through their representative, and the sovereign as their representative represents the will of the multitude. So, within a society, within a country, within a democracy, you have multitude of voices, and that creates confusion on many issues. But which voice is truly representative of the people of that country or that society? It is the voice of their government, which they legitimately elect themselves. So, their voice is legitimately represented by their government, which is the representative of their voice. So, is the case of the sovereign as the representative of the multitude. So, there are often confusion, difference of opinions on many issues, but which is the valid or the legitimate voice of the people is the voice of the sovereign as the representative of the multitude. So, they express or utter their will in unambiguous term or unambiguous voice. Hence, the command of the sovereign is the law, and he carries the sword or coercive means to enforce such laws. So, what happens if the individuals living in a society do not obey the laws or the command of the sovereign? So, that sovereign has the coercive means or the sword to enforce the law. So, the law by its own nature is meaningful when there is a kind of coercive apparatus that back those laws. So, even so in the contemporary discussion on laws, we see that laws should be followed by everyone, because there is other ways of thinking about regulating the conduct of behavior. There could be moral reasoning, there could be religious instruction, there could be ethical concerns. But why law is something which is forceful? Because there is a backup of coercive apparatus of the state. So, there is police, there is army, there is other kind of coercive apparatus through which human beings or the individual can be forced to abide the law. So, here this sovereign provide that necessary power or coercive means through which law can be enforced. Second, the power that a sovereign exercise is authorized by the people. So, it is not given to him naturally or through some other apparatus, but by people themselves. So, the representation and the authorization is something which is derived from the people. People coming together through their voluntary action give certain power to the sovereign. And thus, once a sovereign is created, people are bound to obey its command, as it is their own construct based on their free will through a covenant. So, once a sovereign is institutionalized, it must exercise absolute power over its subject. It is such authority of absolute power or indivisible power that provides the sovereign the requisite power to enforce law and arbitrate among the conflicting parties. So, if a sovereign do not have that coercive power or absolute power, then it would be law without any meaning or merely words with no force at all. So, in the absence of such power or authority, laws would be merely written words without force and could lead to chaos and also back to the state of nature. And anything, according to Hobbes, is preferable to the state of nature, and therefore individual must submit to the will or command of the sovereign. Therefore, the sovereign must exercise absolute power, accountable only to God and his own conscience. So, the sovereign is not accountable to the people. Hobbes argued that the individual should submit to the will of command without scrutiny, because the sovereign know what is best for the people. And once the sovereign is constituted, then what is desirable or undesirable for the nation as a whole or the society as a whole is left to the sovereign, because the sovereign knows what is best. And Hobbes goes to the extent of saying that someone cannot make mistakes, someone cannot do injustice, because if it does, then how one could justify the free will or the voluntary nature of the covenant. So, sovereign is the constitutive of the free will or the voluntary actions of the individual and represent their own will. So, in the exercise of the authority, Hobbes argued the sovereign could not make mistakes. So, therefore, there should be kind of absolute submission to the will or command of the sovereign. So, after the creation of sovereign, people transfer all their rights to that body, that is the sovereign body, except their right to life. And sovereign has absolute, undivided and limitless power to decide and act in a manner it deems fit for protecting the lives of its subject and the preservation of peace and order. Thus, Hobbes does not give the citizen or subject any right to question or criticize the decisions or acts of the sovereign. So, once the sovereign is constituted, he exercises absolute, indivisible and limitless power, accountable only to the God and his own conscience and not to the people who have constituted. So, the command of sovereign is the law that must be obeyed, and sovereign must possess the means to enforce its command, i.e. laws. However, Hobbes thought that the sovereign would exercise this power minimally and left maximum areas of human life free from interference and regulation. So, that is kind of sovereign that Hobbes envisioned, where the Hobbes argue that sovereign will exercise its power and authority in a manner where it leave maximum areas of human life, particularly his civil or private life, free from interference. So, there will be minimum laws and regulation from the sovereign, and that will ensure its longevity. So, he equates the longevity of the sovereign with the prosperity of its subject, and the prosperity can be guaranteed when there is the maximum liberty or freedom to the individual. So, the laws according to Hobbes should be minimal. If there is too many laws, it will become impossible for the sovereign to enforce them. So, if it is minimum, then the sovereign will have maximum power to enforce those laws. But if a sovereign constantly tries to legislate new laws and regulate all the areas of human life, it will become impossible in the long term to force those laws, to enforce those laws, and therefore, to ensure the sustenance or the longevity of the sovereign, it is desirable to control and regulate in the minimum areas of life. And here is a kind of liberal thinking in Hobbesian discourse. Of course, he is the supporter of monarchy, and we will discuss that how we should look at Hobbes more critically when we represent him as the liberal thought or philosopher of the individualist rights and responsibility and so on in the third lecture. But here in Hobbes you have that liberal imagination as well of minimum government with minimum laws. So, Hobbes demarcated the public or political life of state or the sovereign from the private lives or the civic lives of the citizens or subjects. So, in contrast to Aristotle, Hobbes' individual is perfectly okay if he or she does not take any interest in the public and political life. It is the life of the sovereign or the state, and the responsibility of the state is to provide the condition of peace and order for the citizens and subjects to pursue their desire, to lead their personal civic life. So, there is a kind of clear distinction in Hobbes about the public and private, and that becomes the maxim for modern state in modern times. So, and the life of citizens is seen in modern times is that of private life, the pursuit of business, trade, industries, arts, philosophy, science, letters is perfectly okay if individuals do not take any interest or active interest in the matters of the politics or the public matters of the state, which is the concern of the sovereign or the state and its institutions. So, there is a kind of, for a very long time, clear division between public and the private life, which Hobbes also argued. So, here it is vital to understand the Hobbesian conception of liberty, and he gave it a very materialistic definition that is similar to one he gave to human beings and their behavior. So, for Hobbes, liberty is the absence of external impediments or interference. So, in other words, any acts that obstructs the movement of human life as a matter in motion impedes his liberty. So, he gives a very negative conception of liberty if you connect it with Isaiah Berlin, the positive or the negative liberty. And negative liberty is that area of life where we are free from any kind of interference. So, it is freedom from something, and only those areas of life we can say we have liberty or freedom which is free from any external interference or impediments. And positive liberty is to do something, it is the freedom to act something. So, in Hobbesian conception of liberty is like any external impediments or interference in the movement of human life as a matter in motion. So, however, this liberty human beings could enjoy only in a civilized life. However, the human lives, the way he defines is the constant matter in motion, but it can be realized only in a civilized life under the conditions of peace and order. In the state of nature, such liberty exists, but is unrealizable due to constant threat to one's individual life. So, if there is a threat to the life, there is no guarantee or certainty of free movement or the realization of liberty. Its realization of human liberty is possible only under a sovereign. So, Hobbes wants the sovereign to not to interfere in the many areas of individual life, such as their choice of trade, economic dealings and contracts with one another, how they educate their children or their family lives, and so on. So, he wants the sovereign not to interfere in these lives of the individuals. Hobbes argues that for the longevity of their rule, a good monarch or sovereign would not interfere too much in the private lives of the subjects and thereby provide them maximum liberty to pursue their desires. So, the life is about the pursuit of one's desire, and the sovereign would ensure its sustenance if it gives the subjects or the citizens maximum liberty to choose the trade it likes to do, or have contracts with one another in the manner they do, or how to educate their children and how to lead a public life. That should be left for the individual to decide, and the state should not interfere or the sovereign should not interfere in those matters, and that will ensure its longevity in the long term. Now, Hobbes' philosophy also provides the justification for revolt. So, although in Hobbes we have seen that he want the individual to submit to the command of the sovereign, but in certain conditions he gives the individual right to revolt also. So, Hobbes wanted individuals to support and obey the sovereign in all conditions without scrutiny, because the sovereign knows what is good for the people, and that doing or act of the sovereign is just because it represents the will of the people. It is institutionalized in the first place by the people through a covenant. So, individuals should support and obey the sovereign in all conditions without scrutiny. However, he wanted the individual to defend his life individually, not with the assistance or support from others. So, he wanted the individual to defend his life even against the sovereign individually. So, the right to life he gives through the individual even after the creation of the sovereign or the commonwealth authority. Only other rights is transferred to the sovereign on the condition when everyone else agree to the same transfer of their rights to the sovereign body of one man or the assembly of men. However, the individual right to defend his life is there even after the creation of the sovereign. So, individual has the right to defend himself individually without securing assistance from others. In some condition, however, he also gives the individual the right to rebel or revolt against the sovereign, but not in their individual capacity or wisdom, but when there emerge an alternative rebellious groups against the sovereign and sovereign lacks the power to quell them, then an individual could revolt against the sovereign. So, the condition to revolt or rebel against the sovereign is when it lacks the power to quell or defeat any rebellious groups that exist in the society. So, the first condition for the existence of a sovereign and its limitless absolute individual power is its ability to provide peace and order in the society. But if there is a kind of rebellious group or the factions emerge and challenge the existing sovereign, and this existing sovereign fails to quell them or defeat them, then the individual has the right to revolt against such sovereign, because it fails to perform its primary responsibility of providing order and peace in the society. So, Hobbes thus gives the right to revolt to the individuals in a condition when the existing sovereign violates the first law of nature, and that is when it lacks the requisite power and authority to enforce peace or order and fail to arbitrate among the warring factions and groups, and thus rendering civic and peaceful life impossible. And in this condition, Hobbes gives the individual right to revolt against the sovereign. Otherwise, Hobbes provides an unambiguous defense of absolute monarchy and a sovereign body. Thus, Hobbes is accused of putting the life of man at the mercy of the sovereign, which is created in the first place by them to protect it. So, in a way, there is a kind of accusation against Hobbes that by giving the sovereign absolute power, he rendered the life of the individual under the threat of the will or the fancies of the sovereign. So, the sovereign in its exercise of limitless power can pose a threat to the individual life. An individual will have no right to question such acts of the sovereign. So, only in the condition when there is a large group questions the authority of the sovereign and sovereign lacks the ability to quell those rebellion, only then individuals are justified in revolting against the sovereign. Otherwise, if the sovereign takes away the life of individual, his action must not be questioned. So, there is a kind of criticism against Hobbes where he put the individual at the mercy of the sovereign, and this we can discuss in the next lecture also. So, that is all in today's lecture on Hobbes' state of nature, the constitution of sovereign or Leviathan through a covenant or contract, and how such sovereign should exercise absolute and individual power and authority over its subject, and in what condition individuals are justified in revolting against these sovereign or Leviathan. So, on this lecture today you can refer to some of these books: David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to Present; Gary Browning, A History of Modern Political Thought, The Questions of Interpretation; Murray Forsyth and Maurice Soper, A Guide to Political Classics, Plato to Rousseau; Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan you should refer to, which is edited by J.C.A. Gaskin, Oxford University Press; Shefali Jha, Western Political Thought from the Ancient Greeks to Modern Times, is a very good text to understand the state of nature, language of contract and covenant. And similarly, James Allen Rand. I will also request you to look at this text by Richard Took, Leviathan, which is the revised student edition published by Cambridge University Press, to understand the complexities or the logical flow of argument about human nature, state of nature, sovereignty, and the absolute power of this sovereignty and its justification by Hobbes. So, that is all in today's lecture. Do share your comments and feedbacks. We will be happy to listen to or respond to those queries. Thanks for listening.